You can think about the three themes as ways that we can respond to change. So presumably one way that we can respond to change is conservation. Subsequently, in October, the topic or the theme was the heritage industry, particularly focusing on the Singapore girl. So that, I think, was another way of thinking about the kinds of ways we can react to change, which is to turn something into heritage and perhaps into a kind of business. So here in March, the final chapter is centered on the word nostalgia. It also has a title, which is The Vanishing or Time Goes Away. Presumably nostalgia is yet another way we, as a country, as a society, for better or for worse, can respond to change. So this particular panel, Partners in Grime, is part of The Vanishing, but there are a whole bunch of other events that also fall under this umbrella. Next weekend, for example, we have an event that basically mashes up literature and film. In fact, the film that we'll be screening is Tan Pin Pin's In Time to Come, and she's also on the panel with us here today. There is also next weekend a futuristic dining experience. Unfortunately, if you don't already have tickets to those events, you are out of luck because they are fully subscribed. However, there are a bunch of other events that you don't need tickets for, or they are still open. First and foremost are two very interesting installations. The first is an interactive playground that is in the Substation Theatre, and that's in fact designed by Chua, who is on our panel in collaboration with Sumin. The second installation you are actually sitting in the midst of. So this is an installation called Bout of Nostalgia. It's done by Mary Bernadette Lee. And even though you're sitting in the middle of it, we of course will encourage you to engage with it even more at your own time after the panel. In addition to these two installations, for which you don't need tickets, there are also a bunch of children's workshops. I think these range from a workshop on storytelling to a crafting workshop where you'll learn to make kueh, and then there's also a puppet theatre. So these activities are particularly suited for kids between like 2 to 12 or something. Okay, so do consider checking these events out. It is the school holiday, so it's a good way of keeping your kids entertained, I guess. Okay, so as I said, this particular panel is part of Partners in Grime and part of The Vanishing. Even though, as I mentioned, the Substation has been thinking about these 3 months as each having a kind of theme, or maybe because the Substation has been thinking about it that way, we thought it actually might be interesting and important to try to bring two or really all three of the themes together in this panel discussion. So essentially what we're trying to do today is indeed to think about the partnership between nostalgia and heritage conservation, right? We, on some level, and of course we'll hear more about this, our initial sense is that that's actually a very logical partnership in the sense that oftentimes you can, and maybe we do use nostalgia as a way of encouraging people to think about heritage conservation. But today what we're trying to do is explore a little bit the possible cause or the implications or the effects of that kind of partnership. Right? So the way we're going to do this discussion today is to actually try to have a discussion. Our 4 panelists will be conversing with me, conversing with each other, rather than sort of giving a series of consecutive presentations. We'll do this for about an hour and 10 minutes or so, and then at the end, we hopefully will have 15 or 20 minutes for audience questions and interactions with you. Okay, so the terrific panel we have today, I'm going to actually, at this point, ask them to introduce themselves, although I'll maybe talk to them a little bit more about what they do. Shall we do an alphabetical order so that they don't know who's my favorite panelist? So let's start by them.
Hi everybody, I'm Chua. I'm the Executive Director of the Singapore Heritage Society. We're a fully volunteer-run independent voice for heritage conservation in Singapore. I'm also trained as a historian of Singapore history.
Hi, my name is Comaroff. I'm a design consultant with an architecture firm, Lekker Architects. My own training is in architecture and also in urban geography. My thesis was studying the history of haunted spaces and construction spaces in Singapore. Darren.
Hi, I'm Darren. I think we just... yeah, that's really what I do. I'm an architectural photographer, so I make pictures of old and new buildings.
everyone. I'm Bin Bin, and I am a filmmaker. And up until just now, I didn't really consider myself interested in conservation per se.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
But why do you now think you are? Well, this was what we thought we might talk about a little bit more, because on the surface of things, I mean, for example, Eileen, given her position as the executive director of the Singapore Heritage Society, seems like a very logical person to be on the panel. But one reason why we actually wanted a smattering of different talents is because I think, at least in our understanding, conservation is a larger cultural practice, right? So in your case, for example, could you think about your films as conservation films?
I think the difference why I never really attached what I do with conservation is primarily because I see a lot of what I do as a process of discovery of my community, the spaces that I circulate in. So using the camera to document is really a way to try to understand the space. And also to keep the images as a way to record that journey and to keep that journey something that is close to my heart. To actually think of it in terms of, for the use of conservation, just feels as if I'm addressing a much larger audience. And I have to say the initial impetus of collecting these images is never that grand. So I think when just now the consensus seems to be that a lot of my work deals with conservation and not necessarily pro-conservation is a little epiphany for me.
Meaning that actually when you are recording some of these scenes, you don't necessarily begin by thinking of these scenes as requiring conservation. Is that fair to say?
Yes, correct. I mean, the often instinct is, oh, this person is interesting, or this scene is interesting, and to first collect it and then to process the reasons why they're being collected, really maybe months later in the editing.
Although with some of your films, for example, the slightly more experimental, the less mainstream ones, so I'm thinking about, for example, 80 kilometers an hour. So for people who don't know that, that's actually a kind of ongoing project. Can you actually quickly describe what it is?
80 kilometers per hour is a film where I travel across Singapore on a Pan Island Expressway at one speed, 80 kilometers per hour. The initial instinct was to measure how long it takes to start at Changi Airport and end at Tuas checkpoint. But it was also a way to, in a cartographical sense, be able to record literally a cross-section of Singapore. The camera points outwards towards the south side of Singapore, because the starting point is Changi Airport.
And you have sort of streamed those different versions of the film, sort of overlaid on top of each other.
Yeah, so basically across time, different versions are played side by side, so you can actually literally compare different versions together. But now you can't really do it anymore because at the Changi Airport the routing is different.
Right.
Yeah, because of dual. Yeah.
And it probably wouldn't, at some point, the beginning and end of Singapore may also no longer be Changi Airport in Tuas.
Yeah.
Given the amount of recognition with it. Actually, this is kind of an interesting point of comparison with Darren, because Pin was kind of talking about how, in a way, the things that she records, she's maybe not necessarily going into it with a kind of conservationist point of view. Would you say that that's the case for you, or do you, in fact, photograph particular things that you, right from the beginning, feel like, okay, I need to conserve this because somebody should?
I think I started photography when I was very young. So when you start making pictures, you don't really think about it in any larger picture. You just take pictures because it's interesting. Or something that you're photographing seems interesting enough for you to want to take a picture of it. That's why a lot of people take pictures. But I can say this today for everybody here, myself included, the pictures of the food that you photograph at lunch will end up being important historically in about 20, 30 years. Because that's how things are. Everything changes, nothing stays the same. Right? And shouldn't expect food to stay the same over 30 years as well. So the way it's presented, the plate it's on, the background, the hawker center, the restaurant, everything changes. So in that sense, I feel that all photographs are historical in the very large picture. And for me, personally, I began taking pictures, making images of spaces and structures because I realized that Singapore changes really quickly in the urban sense. We tear down old buildings and replace them with new buildings, which are then torn down again and replaced over and over again. It's this cycle, and if you don't document these spaces, at some point in time we will forget what they look like. I mean, we haven't even gone to the stage of thinking what it feels like to be there, because we will have forgotten what they even look like. So for example, Roger Center. There's no Roger Center anymore. It's completely flattened. Even the debris has been removed. So all that's left of Roger today is this empty patch of open space at Roger Road. And it was just 3-4 years ago that the residents moved out. And the pace, when you think about it, it's very frightening. And Singapore is this place where I always tell people, if you go away for any extended amount of time, longer than a month, when you come back, a new shopping mall would have opened, and an old building would have been demolished. And it's not really a joke because that's almost true. Next month, on the 16th, Chua will open. So that will be the main big new draw. Everybody who wants to go and Instagram it. And that's fine, but just bear in mind that in time to come, Chua will become dated, and there will be people debating whether it should be kept or demolished or reused and things like that. So it's cyclical, everything just, except that this is Singapore and things happen much faster.
Is it possible for you to estimate, like if, let's say, if you think about all the photographs you ever taken, especially of Singapore landscape, what percentage of them would you say have now disappeared?
I can tell you that with every passing day, the percentage increases. I can't say exactly for sure because I started taking pictures like 25 years ago. So I have this very peculiar picture made from the top of what used to be the Westin Stamford, and it's now the Swiss Hotel. Taken on the 25th anniversary of Singapore, 1990, when Singapore turned 25. And the picture goes out towards Marina Bay, and it's very strange because besides Marina Square and the 3 hotels there were 3 hotels there because the Ritz-Carlton had not been built. Everything else is dark and empty, except for a place where the older people would know, called Marina South, where there used to be a place called Victor's Super Bowl. All these young people are going to give me these black looks. Victor's Super Bowl, and then there's Steamboat, and then there's a Chinese disco called Kento, which was there, and then there was also some clubs, and there used to be a country club there with a driving range, and people used to go there to play football and to fly kites. So you see, in a relatively short span of time, 25 years, so much has changed just in the Bay Area itself. That if you think about all these other parts of Singapore which are kind of less noticed, neglected. For example, one example is I've been studying a lot of these old maps. Boon Lay. For people who live in Boon Lay, since they were born, they would know that Boon Lay has actually changed a lot. A lot of old flats have been torn down, new flats were built. But if you have no idea where Boon Lay is or think that's part of Malaysia, then you wouldn't know these things.
You might also say something about, although I suspect a lot of the audience members already knows this, can you mention a little bit about the last exhibition you did on objectives? Because I think this is also a good point of connection to, again, I need to talk a little bit about sort of the most recent project that's about
I realized I didn't really answer your question, so, but it ties into that. When I started photography, no, I did not think about it as historical in any way. But as I photographed more and more, and I got older and older, and more of the old pictures that I made became important in a way, because when you look at your old pictures, you're like, oh, this doesn't exist anymore, you know? Or people don't dress like this anymore, and things like that. Then you start to realize how important and how powerful photography and film is when it comes to documenting, right? And so at some point in my life, in the last 10 years, I decided that this is something that needs to be done properly and not just randomly. I happen to be here, I take a picture of this. So I started to actively seek out the more endangered spaces. Because in Singapore, you really need to prioritize, because something is getting torn down every other day. You need to go for those that are going to go first, before going to those that are going to go later, right? Or those that are in limbo. Yeah, so that's how it works.
So that was very much the theme of your exhibition.
Okay, so the exhibition basically covered the big four. It was Park Complex, Pearl Bank, it was Comaroff Tower and Comaroff Complex, as well as I wanted to very systematically cover some public housing estates. So Rochor was in it, Tanglin Hall was in it. So and also Bedok and Buona Vista swimming complexes. At the point in time when I planned the exhibition, Bedok swimming complex had not been demolished, but now it's completely gone. At that point in time when I did my exhibition, Rochor was still up, but if you were at objectives during my exhibition, you could see it being torn down. Right? And now it's gone. Right? So it's true that, you know, this is Singapore, nothing stays the same, everything changes, we all die. But it is my hope that by making these photos, there's a part of these spaces and buildings that will live on longer than all of us.
Darren, do you want to maybe jump in here and talk a little bit about the Big Four and how it relates to your work at SGS?
That's a big question. Do you want to ask me something more narrow or related?
I thought I would just start with something informational and
Okay.
also for people to know that there's a position paper that they can read if they want, and then we'll get specific.
Right, yeah, so the position paper that Manho just mentioned, some of you picked it up on the desk outside. It's about giving new lease of life to Singapore's modernist icons. Was the big advocacy issue for last year, really looking at these icons of Singapore's modern architecture and what might be the future for them. So conservation, not just preserve and that's the end of the story, but really thinking about what could be the future for them as well. And in the position paper, we gave a lot of recommendations for possible avenues that could be looked at, which are policy options which are currently not being used in Singapore, or how they could be preserved. And also draw reference from, I think one of the things that people think is that brutalist buildings are ugly, may not deserve to be preserved, but around the world there are UNESCO World Heritage Sites that are modern architecture. So internationally people have recognized and appreciated this kind of architecture. There's no reason why we can't as well.
So just to fill everyone in again, I imagine many people know the Big Four, as Darren mentioned, are Pearl Bank Apartments, Golden Mile Tower, Golden Mile Complex, and People's Park Centre Complex.
Yeah. So actually in our position paper, we only argue for 3 because we're choosing the ones of greatest architectural merit that we feel that there's a strong argument for if we're going to ask for conservation status. So that would be Pearl Bank Apartments, Golden Mile Complex, and People's Park Complex. And just as a side note, the founder of Singapore Heritage Society is the architect William S.W. Lim, who of course was part of the team who designed Golden Mile Complex and People's Park Complex.
So maybe just to reiterate the point that when we were thinking about convening this particular panel, we were taking a relatively kind of loose and large definition of conservation. conservation. So obviously with someone like Eileen who actually works at the voices of artists, photographers, filmmakers, and architects who, in kind of a larger sense, kind of work with conservation as well. Now, the other kind of key term in our title, other than conservation, is nostalgia. So maybe it's worth talking a little bit about what that term means. Maybe that's a kind of relatively common understanding, although it's also a word that's so used and overused that maybe a kind of definition is worth putting forth. So I'll try a few definitions. If you have objections, you can jump in. So I think generally speaking, most people understand nostalgia as a feeling. Oftentimes it's described as a bittersweet feeling, which means that I think even though there's a lot of regret that comes with nostalgia when you're looking back on something, there's oftentimes a suggestion that there's a little bit of bittersweetness to it as well, right? So here the idea is that sometimes you in fact quite enjoy reminiscing about the good old days, which as we will see is sometimes a bit of a critique of it. I think historically, the nostalgia really kind of starts as a synonym for homesickness. People who've read about this might know the kind of famous fact that the word nostalgia actually was first coined by a Swiss medical student, Johannes Hofer, who wrote a dissertation in like 1680 something, where he actually tried to argue that Swiss soldiers were suffering from homesickness, or as he would call it, nostalgia. In fact, he really kind of talked about this as a kind of medical illness. I think commonsensically we do think of that no longer as a kind of medical or even a kind of overly psychological category. So it does tend to be kind of a common word used now. But I think it's fair to say that it's still considered a form of homesickness, at least in a kind of symbolic sense. So another argument that sometimes has been made is that it's homesickness, but home doesn't necessarily have to be a specific space, right? For example, it's homesickness, not house sickness. It can also be a time that perhaps represents home for you. I think another distinction that's sometimes made that is perhaps useful, especially given the composition of our panel, is that you will see that some theorists actually talk about nostalgia. So here I'm actually drawing upon the work of a guy named Paul Grange. If you picked up a copy of the reading list, you'll find some of these names if you're interested. But Paul Grange is a theorist who kind of talked about nostalgia as both, in his language, both a mood and a mode. And in my understanding, what he is suggesting is that, of course, you can talk about nostalgia as a feeling that people might have, right? And because if you do that, then you can sort of say, I am nostalgic, you are nostalgic. But his point is also to say that, well, we can also think about nostalgia as a mode, as a kind of artistic mode or an aesthetic mode. And if that's the case, then it would make sense to say, not just that I am nostalgic, but you could sort of say, this photograph is nostalgic, or this photograph is not nostalgic, because it's utilizing certain kinds of aesthetic modes to signify, or even create, or evoke nostalgia, right? In fact, I think because nostalgia is considered, or can be thought of as an aesthetic mode, this is oftentimes why we are able to see commoditized versions of nostalgia. This is maybe a good point to quickly talk about what some of our panelists view has been happening to nostalgia in kind of the Singapore commercial landscape. Do you want to say a few things, Josh?
Yeah, I think it's very kind of a really interesting aspect of the question, because you know, I've lived now for 18 years in Singapore, right? So I left the US as the longest I've lived in any city, so I have no metric as to how nostalgic people in other places are. I've just been here.
Right.
So, but one of the things that seems to be very interesting about nostalgia here was kind of how quickly we selected certain icons, like the dragon, the pelican. It's a pelican. Yeah. And how quickly those were commercialized. So, you know, it seems like an entire industry sprung up around those old playgrounds. And now if you go to National Design Center and you have like $150 in your pocket, you can get like a commemorative ceramic coin bank or something that's shaped like either of those. You know, there's a kind of I don't know, to me, a kind of an unsettling quality about how these things went from a kind of emotional position that had to do about space and time and loss, and very quickly became, you know, basically kind of the next generation of souvenir shops for hipsters, right? I mean, it's got a kind of it's kind of ironic, not ironic. It has a weird relationship to emotion. Yeah, I think it's very much a kind of like a hipster That's why, if you guys see on the inside, the dragon is actually vomiting coins. He's got like coins coming out of his mouth. I don't think it made it to the illustration, but you can go and check it out. So I think part of this is a concern that not about nostalgia. I think nostalgia is probably not innocent, right? No emotion is innocent. And if we look at different kinds of nostalgia around the world, we see very different varieties. Right. Like for example, like in Brazil, they always talk about saudade do futuro, which is like nostalgia for the future, which often has to do with utopian schemes that don't quite work, right? So Brasilia is a major site of saudade do futuro, right? And in Germany, there's this sense of good. When I wrote the essay for your book, we talked about that a lot, which was a longing for a place you've never been, which seems to also be like very Instagram ready, right? So it seems like so nostalgia obviously is culturally constructed in certain kinds of ways, and I'm sure it's quite unique in the Singaporean edition, right? But I do think that when we think of the uses of it, when it's put to, I do certainly have some concerns about not only nostalgia primarily, but what ends are we putting nostalgia toward? Because like all other kind of political affect, it seems to me to be like a very dangerous thing if we use it in an automatic or unthinking way.
In fact, since we are on this topic and since we have you on the mic, can you say something about why you in fact decided to do for your installation a children's playground?
Well, I thought it was really interesting because my children were given lots of like hipster crap for kids, like a really cute, like a beautiful merlion.
That's
which is like a cute merlion, not a hideous merlion, not like the old lighters or the durian chocolates, that used to be in the old shops, like Golden Landmark Hotel, those places where they had the really bad, and so these things are like aesthetically pleasing, they're cute, they're seizing on marginalia, like you can get like a little miniature red plastic chair, right? And in a way, the aesthetic appeal of them was kind of interesting to me because I was kind of horrified and attracted to them at the same time. Like I kind of wanted to buy them and it was making me feel guilty. But my kids were given a lot of this stuff and I noticed that they were suddenly talking about the Dragon Playground like almost in a kind of like melancholic tone. They've never been there and now I don't want to take them there because I feel like if they go, everything is already, like they've experienced it already,
And mostly know it through Darren's photographs, presumably.
Well, no, through like a million different representations, I think. It's everywhere. It really is, to an incredible extent. And also the way that it's handled, I think, is interesting, like kind of enamel pins where the outline of it is gold, which to me also seems like aesthetically very contradicted to the kind of, what I love about those playgrounds is their roughness, right? They break every contemporary safety standard, and they're very crudely built, and their evocative quality, I think, in part comes from that. It's probably a certain relationship to brutalism, right, where there's a kind of a roughness and a melodrama about form, which makes it very appealing.
They were very quickly gotten rid of in the 90s because there was a series of accidents involving kids on them, which strangely did not happen in the 70s and 80s. I don't know why. And then in the 90s, there were these accidents, some of them quite bad, and then suddenly the HDB decided, okay, we're just going to get rid of most of them and replace them with this generic American-built ones with the modular things that we see everywhere now. So that's just some backstory on why they were very quickly.
The modern ones, by the way, come with a safety certificate. Which means that actually the way that you test it is amazing. They take a watermelon, which is roughly the size of a child's head, and they drop it. It's kind of a disgusting way. But sorry, you're gonna.
Now I'm completely distracted by the watermelon head. But I take your comments to partly be pointing to the fact that it's the kind of commodification of these kinds of artifacts that might even have instilled a sense of nostalgia in your children, right? But would you, at the same time, say that it's also possible, I guess, in some kind of pure, unadulterated way, even for kids to feel nostalgia?
Definitely. One of the really strange things is my kids, I have three, and two of them always expressed a longing to be a baby. When they had a late third happened, and they would see my partner holding the baby and they say, oh, I feel like I don't want to grow up. I don't, you know, it was this anxiety, but what was interesting is the nostalgia was quite projective. It was a concern about growing up. And frankly, this was, my daughter was at RGPS participating in the Great Singaporean War on Childhood, you know, and all of the parents were going into some kind of like arms race to see who could like enrich their children more. And I think there was this sense that suddenly like that, like the threshold of nostalgia for like, oh, the good old innocent days, but it's gone back to nappies now. Like even toddlers are kind of like, they look nervous, like they need to top up their cash card or something. Like, so I feel like with them there was this sense of like wanting to find that place. And the thing is, and I think we were talking about this a little bit earlier, which made it something interesting to bring up, is that now our sense of time has become so hyperbolic that the threshold of childhood seems to be kind of like turning into something where, and what's interesting to me about that is that kids who are not really toddlers, but like 5, 6-year-olds would be aware of this sense of time in such a dramatic way.
Yeah, I think that's only tracks with my kind of observations as well. That, I mean, typically, I think we more conventionally think about nostalgia as like the province of older people, right? Such as the ones on this panel, right? Oh, that's when you attain like the condition to be nostalgic when you in fact have good old days to think back on, right? But I think part of the point, even just from observation, that is probably not at all the case, right? From a kind of national point of view, the point has been made. So here, sometimes people might say that, oh, Singapore is a relatively young country, right? In fact, we're told that we only have 50 years of history, right? So, like, how is it possible for we as a country to be nostalgic? Although there's also a very good response from historians, right? So historians, for example, in Lokai Singh's book about Give Me Around Fires, he points out that it's really not about the actual length of time, right? But it's about how extensive the changes are, or how vivid that sense of time is, right? So he in particular points out that with Singapore, the degree and the extent of changes, for example, to our landscape is so drastic, right? It's probably quite unique in the world in the sense that within one generation, public housing, for example, the shape of public housing has completely changed, right? So with the exception of one kampong, you don't see that on the landscape anymore, right? So whether that takes place over the course of 100 years or whether it takes place over the course of 50 years, as is the case in Singapore, that can be this kind of condition for feeling nostalgic about the country, right? So in terms of definition, that's also something that people sometimes kind of talk about, right? That nostalgia is oftentimes sort of most ripe when it tends to happen when these kinds of drastic or kind of almost kind of earth-shaking changes happen to a country or to a culture and so on. So we have been talking kind of a little bit more generally about the notion of nostalgia, which is useful. For our purposes, we do want to maybe, at least for a few moments, sort of narrow it back down to the conjunction of nostalgia and conservation, right? So again, what we are hoping to think a little bit more about is whether it makes sense to use nostalgia, keeping in mind the fact that since it is a mode, since it is a style, it can be used in the service of conservation. Here, maybe let's start with Eileen and get some comments about this, right? So I guess in your case, the idea of like using nostalgia and arguing for conservation is a very real thing, right? So you alluded, for example, to the position papers that you and SH has write. Can you talk a little bit about when you're writing those things, to what sense do you think about invoking, even before we get to nostalgia, like evoking feelings?
I think the position paper we don't write it with the idea of feelings in mind because it's meant to speak to policymakers. So we give academic arguments, we look at policy issues, we try to argue for best practices in heritage management and conservation and urban planning. So that's, I think nostalgia doesn't really come into play with this. And I think at this point, I'd like to make a distinction between nostalgia and feelings, because there are lots of different kinds of feelings. Nostalgia, as you said, is bittersweet, but it's looking on the past in a favorable way. And feelings and human experience is very complex and nuanced, and nostalgia maybe tends to simplify that whole range of your human experience or your own life experience. So I like to think of feelings in terms of emotional literacy. To what extent are we aware of, able to identify, and able to articulate that whole range of subtle feelings within ourselves, which may be quite complex or not so straightforward. So being able to work with all of that, and also see, and then I think see how that can feed into what we feel is important for us to argue for conservation for. So it's not nostalgia per se, but I think there's a role for us to acknowledge that kind of feeling within us. Partly because in Singapore, we're dealing with a situation where, I think we've been trained to be particularly unemotional. There's certain, sentimentality is a bad word. We have to be really practical, really utilitarian, absolutely logical. And I think that drains us of our humanity. So how do we bring that sense of humanity, that soul, with back into the work that we do? And I'm not sure nostalgia is the answer to that. My answer is emotional literacy. And really there's a whole complex range of things. Even with the en bloc issue, if any of you saw the Instagram short film competition that we had at the substation, and the grand prize winner has an interview with someone who's been at Golden Mile Complex right from the very beginning. And he says, you know, both he'll miss the place, it's going to be hard to move, but at the same time kind of accepts, or maybe, you know, change has to happen. The building is old, those who live there deal with a lot of maintenance issues and the financial burden that comes with that. So there's no clear, straightforward answers. And nostalgia sometimes tends to tell us like, you know, it was all good in the past and it's all rosy and, you know,
right.
so.
But even though you argue for essentially the importance for us as a country to be more feelings, but at the same time you would say that you wouldn't put those kinds of feelings or that kind of rhetoric into a position paper.
And I wouldn't, and not specifically nostalgia, I think, but yeah.
Why not?
Yeah.
Why not nostalgia?
No,
Why
why don't you put
feelings in a position paper? Because that's going to be particularly hard to speak. It will not speak to the policymakers who need to understand.
Present it on National Day.
Yeah, okay. So, but nostalgia, National Day is also a certain kind, it's only a certain range of feeling that so, as we were chatting earlier, and I was talking about, for example, some of the work that we've been doing in Chinatown. And for me, that covers the whole spectrum of different registers that we use in our advocacy work. So we've got the hardcore research, we've done a cultural mapping, we've got a database, we've done a policy analysis exercise with students from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So that's the real hardcore stuff. But through our knowledge of the people on the ground, the networks that we have, we've also been working very closely with Drama Box. How many of you watched Chinatown Crossings last year, if you were lucky enough to get a ticket? Yeah, only one hand gone up. Yeah, so it's coming again this year. But for me, that's an example of how the work that we do can then be used as deep material for artists to turn into a form that has emotional resonance for the general public. So that yeah.
But to broaden the question a little bit away from like the actual writing of the position paper, right? So is it your sense and the rest of the panel that, and again, let's not even talk about nostalgia yet, right? So let's just talk about your category, feelings and sentiment. Is that for us a viable basis on which to decide on matters of conservation?
I think there's a whole range of different considerations to bring in, and there's a balance between the feelings and the kind of the hardcore history or architectural assessment that goes into it. So there are all these different considerations that would come into play, I think.
Instagram likes.
But you or SHS would probably hesitate to base an entire conservation case on the notion that, let's say, a space or a building has important, like symbolic or lived meanings for particular populations. Would that be the case?
I think the danger is that nostalgia kind of seems to be some people may be able to apply to closing down, don't close down my old school, preserve this. Almost anything can become, a subject for art that people want to preserve on the basis of nostalgia. So how do we decide? We can't say everything.
And to be a little bit informational for a minute, although I don't want you to speak for URA, but as far as you understand, the technical, actual conservation of guidelines are mostly tagged to relatively objective markers like architectural. It's very seldom or like never about, oh, this space is important in the national memory kind of thing, right?
So there are basically two legislations under which a building can be officially conserved. One is URA's conservation, under URA conservation, where they assess buildings for architectural merit, and one is as a national monument under NHB, and those buildings have to be of national historical significance. However, I would say that URA is moving towards the direction of beginning to take social memories into consideration a bit more. So you see in the last round, the last master plan in 2014, they had buildings which fell more into this category. My community in Queenstown had a position paper where they argued a whole bunch of buildings in Queenstown to be conserved, and quite a few of those were accepted for conservation. Yeah, so I think URA is beginning to look at that a little bit more, but very much still on the basis of architectural merits.
Just to ask, because I actually don't really know about how the conservation process works very well here. I mean, I've dealt with a lot of URA conservation officers, but it is our questions of where does old lookingness come into this? Do you know what I mean? In the sense of it seems like it's much easier to get a shop house conserved than it would be an excellent modern building, even though a lot of shop houses, frankly, are not of great architectural merit or quality. They're badly ornamented, they're badly built, but they're historically very interesting, they're an integral part of the urbanism here. We never argue for knocking them down, but it seems like
very early.
No, but now we're in this phase where we don't knock them down anymore.
I'll explain.
Is it a touristic?
Yes.
Yes.
Is this particularly an issue with the Big Four that we were talking about? Because at least in the kind of popular imaginary, those are considered somewhat ugly buildings because they are so brutalist, right?
Yeah, so the reverse to this could be too ugly to save. Which, there are a lot of people out there who are very vocal about this, right? That Burbank is a dump, that it really needs to go.
Right. But do you therefore, for example, do you either consciously or on some subconscious level feel like part of my job as a photographer could be to make these look more beautiful? Because presumably that would open the door to people feeling more strongly about the need to preserve.
Is this a picture of a picture?
It
is, right?
No.
Well, because my building,
sorry, this is your photograph.
Yeah, I know, but it's the picture of my picture.
It might be, yes.
Yeah, because it's supposed to be straight. But okay, so here's the thing, see. When I photograph these buildings, obviously, as I do with all buildings, I do not give them any special care in terms of, I will just photograph them in good light, but I photograph all buildings in good light, whether they are new buildings or old buildings. So, in a way, my approach to architectural photography is very much from an architectural photographer's point of view, which is to be very technical and almost clinical, right? Yeah. So I let the architectural merits speak for themselves in the photos.
Is this specifically because you want to avoid evoking nostalgia? You don't want to be accused of, let's say, putting a nice filter on it to make it look.
I don't think a nice filter can make the facade of Rose Park any less or more interesting than it already is. But having said that, there are people who are, people out there are very polarized about, for example, the facade of Rose Park. or this facade, for example. I mean, there are people who claim that, you know, let's move on because this is dated. We already have other terrace buildings that are in existence, like Sky Habitat. We should just get rid of this and make better use of the space. And you know, so there will always be arguments like that.
Sure, but why, it might sound like I was trying to convince you not to do it, but why would we avoid making the building look more evocative and nostalgic? I mean, if, just go with me for a minute, right? I mean, if that's actually what it takes to drum up more feeling and therefore more popular support, to sort of photograph it or to film it in particular ways that become more evocative and get people to feel like, oh, it would be a shame to lose this because it's a beautiful feeling or a beautiful building or something that I feel. Why do we hesitate to do that? Should we hesitate to do that?
Because, let me tell you, it's one simple reason. Every film and every photograph that we make is just a representation. It's not the real thing. You need to experience the building for yourself. And if you're in Singapore, there's no excuse for you not to experience it. You don't have to travel very far. It's not like I have to go all the way to Paris to see the Louvre. So, if you know you want to experience, if you want to criticize a building, experience it first. Right. Similarly, if you want to speak about the merits of a building or to champion for its salvation, you should also experience it.
Right, but I guess the idea that any photograph is a representation, you might almost sort of say that it then frees you from thinking that you need to represent it in a clinical way that gets you to the actual way the building looks, right? Because any way you represent it is still going to be a representation.
Maybe it's like, you could go too far in trying to put on the nostalgia filter, then it just looks cheesy and it will turn.
So how far is too far? Can I maybe get Pin to talk about your films? Like, do you tend to hesitate to represent space? I mean, are you likewise feeling like, okay, I need to represent spaces in a kind of pure, honest way and to stay away from making them like too sentimental, too evocative? In Time to Come is quite, I don't know if clinical is the right word, but it's very stark, right? Was that, for example, a conscious choice with regards to like not wanting to make a nostalgic picture about time capsules?
It's quite funny because I was just thinking that it is in a way a film about being sian.
Sure.
Yeah, the national sianness.
Yeah. It's ennui, right?
Ennui of repetition.
Everyone's just sitting around waiting.
Everyone is just waiting. I think it has its uses, and I'm going off the point of what Kylie was saying, where she says as historical society, heritage society, SHS, it has to take a certain tone in its presentation and its position paper. And she sort of had an off-the-cuff remark where she says, "We leave it for the artist to deliver the rest of the things." So I feel as if that's where myself and Darren come to the blanks. And interestingly, me and Darren are probably a lot more similar in terms of tone and the way we represent what we film. Then I almost feel as if you need another director or another photographer. In fact, it could be maybe Noan might be a different photographer than Darren, because Noan in a way goes slightly in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
And both are wonderful photographs as well. So my feeling is I almost distrust stories, and I distrust being manipulated, and so my act, at least within Time to Come, was to run as far away from that as possible, as another way of exploring representation of a country after, To Singapore with Love, which is of course 100% personal and 100% narrated based. The trajectory of the exiles are very, very clear. Whereas within Time to Come, you I'm left with a feeling of just experiencing the waiting in real time.
Since you mentioned your second most recent film, maybe we can talk about that and actually use that to think a little bit about the politics of nostalgia, right? So as you mentioned, your famous film, To Singapore with Love, about political exiles. Well, first of all, that film does begin at least by portraying the political exiles' feelings or even nostalgia about Singapore. Is that fair to say? It begins with someone trying to recreate Changping, right? Okay. Was that like a mindful decision to show them as having these kinds of feelings, which of course are partly quite fraught and contradictory, because how do you feel nostalgic about a country that, to all intents and purposes, seem to have rejected you?
Right.
Was that part of the idea of like how that movie opens? And was there like, did you have some debate about whether this was like the approach to take?
I mean, even with that film, the formal decisions were made first. First of all, that it would be just a series of interviews, and the interviews would be filmed straight on, so there's actually no artifice. And I was quite clear that there would not be a sad soundtrack. In fact, there's no soundtrack, maybe apart from
There is a song at the end.
yeah, Francis,
Right.
apart from Francisco's song at the end. So there was a little bit of concession to be sad.
Okay.
But because his whole story was premised on the music he made, it would make sense to actually showcase some of his music. I was very aware that, I mean, the word nostalgia means missing home anyway. So any story about political exiles, especially with exiles who haven't been home, would touch on that. But I think as we were editing, we were very clear to keep it very, very straight. Because I would feel that the power of the film would be discounted if it was perceived as being trying to be too emo.
Sure. Although
So in a way, it's kind of like argument about, when you're writing a position paper,
right.
you have to be quite careful about the tone.
Although here maybe we could distinguish between the film and the subjects in the film. Right?
Yes.
So the way you're talking about the film as taking this kind of fairly kind of factual approach,
Yes.
certainly that's the case. But for better or for worse, the subjects are, in your words, quite emo, as they have every right to be, by the way, right?
Yes.
But was that, for example, but then of course the film then does make a kind of choice as to show them being emotional and longing for a home, right? Does that, for example, was there any worry that, okay, this is in a way almost, so I'm ventricalizing here, right? So was there any worry that, okay, this is a way of humanizing them but almost defaming the political exiles? Like to almost kind of present them as human like you and me, which they are, right? But like as less of a threat, like, oh, he's just an older man who longs for chocolate girl. I'm ventricalizing. I'm not necessarily saying that this is the case, but
I think when we were editing the film, we couldn't have a lot of hard information.
okay.
As you know, the archives, we don't have any access to archives. So whatever they told me had to stand on its own. So the more, and if I felt that if the film was factually inaccurate, then that would be grounds
Sure.
to debar the film.
Yeah.
So
Detective.
what we are dealing with then is how to present personalities and information without having the full story, and yet you have to be 100% correct. So I felt that the only way to do that was to have them talk about their experience, because no one will take away from what they are feeling.
Since we, in a way, are beginning to sort of touch on like politics with a capital P, I wanted to ask the panel. So one oftentimes standard critique of nostalgia is that it just is inherently conservative, right? Here the argument has to do with even like if you think about what the word means, right? That nostalgia is oftentimes about looking to the past as opposed to the future. So by definition, it's afraid of change, it's holding on to the past. Even from a kind of political point of view, the opposite of conservatives are supposedly progressives who are therefore looking to the future, right? So because of those associations, there's almost a kind of slightly knee-jerk argument that, well, by definition, nostalgia is always going to be politically conservative. Cool. Like, any reaction?
I think that might follow logically if the essence of nostalgia is assuming that the past is better than the present. There are a lot of weird nostalgias in the world, right? Part of the Putin phenomenon is a huge nostalgia for the USSR, which objectively is really weird, right? I mean, there are a lot of people that get out of prison have nostalgia for aspects of their prison days. I'm not sure they would choose necessarily to restore or conserve that experience, but they do revisit that experience with a mixture of probably nostalgia and trauma and all these kind of psychological forms that don't resolve themselves with time or with thought, right? Every time you go back to it, it's still potent, you can't resolve it, it's like a puzzle piece that doesn't fit and you keep turning around, right? I don't actually feel that nostalgia, although I'm very suspicious of nostalgia in general, I don't feel that its major ill is conservatism. I also think that now we're in a very weird historical moment where progressive and conservative have to be reconsidered in some way. Like, I am very strongly pro-conservation. I'm kind of in a way anti-development. I'm anti-architecture in a way, because I feel that we've entered a completely unsustainable kind of euphoric expansion of building that we can't afford and that we don't need, and that it's just, I mean, it's like, this is a terminal condition, right? If we don't stop doing this, we will objectively, like, destroy the world for our grandchildren's generation. So, to me, right now, being conservative is actually a very politically radical position to take. Say, don't make money knocking down a mall to build a slightly bigger mall because the government gave you a higher FAR, which means you can make more money off of it. Let's not do that, right? I believe that adaptive reuse should be our first go-to strategy because we just can't do it any other way. And I think that we forget this because architects are wonderful at selling fantasy, like the green building. There is no such thing as a green building. You know these buildings here that have all of this green stuff like dripping off of it? Those are the low tar cigarettes, okay? They're slightly less bad, you smoke them and they will kill you, okay? And environmentally that's the fact, right? There is no such thing as a non-green building. It's a massive use of resource, use of energy, it's damaging, and all of the embodied energy and what used to be there is just chucked away, mainly for aesthetic and stylistic purposes, right? So, I mean, I think in some ways, conservation, or at least a kind of a nostalgia that translates into an anger at seeing these kinds of very large-scale obscenities being put up in place of things. I think now we really have to get to a stage where you have to really make a very convincing argument to knock a building down. But that's not how we're thinking about it. So I'm a little, I'm not so eager to link conservancy with conservatism politically anymore.
To maybe put it in a slightly different way, so those kinds of easy and pre-made associations don't seem to make sense because it largely depends on the context, right?
Yeah.
Would we maybe even go further to say that actually within the political context that we do find ourselves in, which is in large part politics that's very much based on the doctrine of progress and development, almost to a relentless pace, then from that point of view, conservation or conservancy actually arguably has the power to be radical and to be progressive.
Conservancy is effectively the left-wing option in Singapore, right? Our progressivism, and this is not making any judgment of it, it's a very successful developmentalist model, but it's an illiberal progressivism. It's not socially progressive, right? It's socially agnostic in a lot of times. And one of the things I think is most interesting about Singapore, for me, coming from an American standpoint, where there is zero social safety net, where people will vote against their own pragmatic self-interest of having a nationalized health system. You know, in Singapore, there are many things in the political cocktail that come from the left traditionally and come from the right? There are a lot of people that joined the PAP because they were socialists, right? There's that whole Fourier socialist kind of thread that comes into it. So I think here we're dealing with a very interesting situation where we cannot, in a conventional sense, assign kind of political characteristics globally. It's
centers on the relationship between not just nostalgia, but between history and heritage, and maybe also memory. So maybe one way of getting into this is for me to ask Darren to talk a little bit about this picture that you asked me to put up.
It does look very dark. The future is very dark. Okay, this is not the real thing.
So do you want to explain what this actually is? Yeah.
It's not the real thing in many ways. This is a picture, so that's not the real thing, obviously. It's also not the real playground. If you were there when, I'll explain it about, if you were there where I was when I made this picture, you would realize that these were actually made of canvas and plastic and with a wire frame in there. And there were floats that were paraded in Marina Bay last year during National Day. So what happened was we got rid of most of these playgrounds because they were safety hazards. And then in 2015 we realized that, oh, SG50, they can be very useful for nostalgia. So we brought them back out, dusted off whatever was left. By the way, the Pelican does not exist anymore. The last Pelican was demolished in 2012 at Dover Estate. But if you go to KL today, you will find a Pelican there, which something that hasn't been explained well. But never mind, we're not talking about that today. A lot of our playgrounds that exist in Malaysia, by the way. This is strange. Okay. But anyway, so the thing is this, before 2015, before SG50, the remaining playgrounds were just then, they were old playgrounds that were left over from the 70s. They were not very safe as determined in the 90s. And then most of them were demolished. So what happened was in SG50, they were dug out of the woodwork and then used as this icon of nostalgia and of memory and of history. And I don't think Mr. Kaur, the designer of these playgrounds, was ever as busy in his life as he was in 2015, when he was interviewed left, right, center by everybody about the playground. So I'm sure he finds it amusing to some extent. Like, why is this suddenly happening? And the thing is this, because a playground has all these inbuilt signifiers, childhood, memory, old, blah, 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 everything, right? So you put them all together and you have this SG50 thing, and then it becomes this icon that has kind of grown beyond whatever, anybody has imagined it could ever do. And then last year, they were brought out again and paraded. And I made a social media post about it. And literally, it was like my childhood floating away. Because they were on these floats on the water in Marina Bay. And then they were floating away. And there are two dragons left. Only one in original condition. The one in the bio. There's one in Ang-Mo-Kio, but it's gotten more sandpit and it's in a strange color. There's no more pelican. There's one dove left, which is in Dakota. So that whole thing has been conserved. 6 blocks plus the playground, which is good. But other than that, there were a lot of other things. There was the elephant. There's one elephant left. It's in Pasir Ris. In order to see it, you have to bash through thick grass because it's in the former chalet for the home team. It's still intact, 100%. There used to be other dragons, they were all gone. There are 2 more dragons, small dragons, they're still around. Okay, but I digress. Anyway, what happened is this, because the dragon almost became this national icon icon of Singapore, which is very strange. And then we had a lot of things happen in 2015. We had a general elections. So if you were from the Bishan to GRC, you will realize that the candidates of the PAP candidates of Bishan to GRC took their photos in front of the dragon. And they used that and sent it to every household and said, vote for PAP. Okay? So that was one of the ways the dragon was used. The dragon, like I said, it's been used in pins and marks and whatever you have. And today, if you go to the newly renovated HDB gallery in Toa Payoh, at the basement, you will see a dragon there, and it's got slide, and then you can use the slide. And it's strange because it's kind of like backpedaling, but because it's useful and it's convenient to use it as a rallying icon. To what end, I'm not sure, because after SG50, it's kind of like, exhausted. Is
it fair to say, also having read your Instagram post, are you or like the panel, generally speaking, so let's start generally first, a little nervous or even suspicious about the focus on heritage nowadays?
Okay, I mean, I don't think anybody would have any mistakes about this. When heritage can be used for political ends, it will be. It doesn't only mean it happens in Singapore, it happens everywhere. Okay? When something can be harnessed as a simple icon to rally people behind you, it will be used. Okay? It can be, in our case, it happened to be the dragon. Yeah. And the pelican, which actually doesn't even exist anymore. So that is really strange. I feel that to be suspicious is, yes, we should be. But at the same time, I myself view it with some kind of amusement, actually.
Yeah, I guess I can chop in the question this way, right? Part of this connects back to Joshua's earlier point when he talked about, let's say, the commodification of these, whatever, like pins that you have, right? And as many of you know, there's that famous website called Simisai, also SG50, that was a catalog of all the ways SG50 became a kind of branding tool for like fish cakes and so on, right? So of course, one possible objection is to point to the way heritage gets commodified, right? But I'm also wondering whether there's a slightly different but related issue, which is whether the focus on heritage in your mind and your reading is coming at the expense of something else. For example, history, right? So here I'm thinking about the fact that actually there have been some American historians who have, so of course here they are writing from a kind of American perspective. So, and the people I'm thinking about, people like Michael Kamen and David Lowenthal. So these historians actually have regarded what they call the heritage boom with a lot of suspicion, right? Michael Kamen, for example, begins by talking about how, to him, it is very bizarre, and maybe this is also what you mean, that in America, on the one hand, there's a lot of fascination with heritage, but he says there's absolutely 0-degree historical knowledge, right? So how can the two coexist? And I think actually part of his point is that the two coexist because one, in a way, causes the other, right? That this kind of obsessive focus on heritage actually is at the expense of a kind of more profound historical knowledge, right? Now, I mean, you could say that this is maybe a snobbish way of thinking about history, but this is actually kind of his argument, right? He's sort of saying, and if you do want to maybe extend it to Singapore, at least hypothetically, you could sort of say, well, actually many of the things that we choose to focus our heritage energies on are relatively, for the sake of argument, fairly easy targets, right? For the most part, nobody is ever not on board with preserving food. Everybody loves food, right? But then, arguably, when it gets to harder issues that have more kind of historical stuff behind it, it perhaps becomes a little bit more difficult, right? Let me maybe get some reactions from my do you feel, for example, that heritage and history are sometimes at odds? For example, although this might sound like a slightly weird question, why is the Singapore Heritage Society not the Singapore Historical Society?
Historical.
Historical.
Although actually, if you Google Singapore Historical Society, you get Singapore Heritage Society's website. Interesting. Yeah. But why don't we have a Singapore Historical Society?
I think to us, heritage is the living presence of the past. That's the simple, easy definition that we use. And I think it's because for us, heritage is about the city. It's the bits of the past, of history that are around us, that we still have with us. History, one definition of it is that it's the academic study of what happened in the past. But when we talk about advocacy and heritage, it's also not just the research and what happened in the past, but also the bits of that are still with us today, around us, in our lives, what it means to us. So grappling with all of that, I think, is what heritage is about. I think you're right to say that, well, maybe not heritage and history, but maybe positioning that sense of nostalgia with deep historical knowledge is definitely a kind of contrast that I think is at play here. We do see a lot of interest in heritage issues. For example, Rotel Center became very popular with people Instagramming and got a lot of popular interest. Many people gravitate towards public housing because that's something that they can relate to. But what about something more distant like Fort Canning and 700 years of Singapore history? To me, that's always been the one thing that I would like Singaporeans to take away, to know that there's a much, much longer past to Singapore history. So we don't just need to talk about preserving things that may be 30 years old, but we've got a 700-year history to think about as well. Bukit Brown, for example, is one case where it's much less about that personal connection. You might think that Bukit Brown is people who have ancestors buried there are the ones gravitating towards Bukit Brown. Well, the Bukit Brownies, the volunteer guides who lead the tours there, most of them do not have any family members buried in Bukit Brown. And their commitment and love for the site is really because of the place itself. The awe-inspiring nature of the place as a nature and history site, the kind of histories that are there, how fascinating, deep and rich it is. For me, Bukit Brown is the perfect example of how history can be compelling. The Brownies, I met many of them on their very first visit to Bukit Brown. They are not people from the heritage history circles. They're from totally different backgrounds. Some of them maybe work in healthcare or something like that. Actually, a few of them work in healthcare. So it's really how compelling history can be. If it doesn't mean that it's boring and something people automatically get turned off.
Sure, but again, one possible critique that I've seen made is that sometimes in the process of trying to make history compelling, you turn it into heritage by making it somewhat overly personal and therefore prone to nostalgia, right? I mean, again, this is not necessarily my argument, but Josh, do you want to jump in before Pin?
I'll just jump in with a quick statement. I think heritage is a mark. It makes history stand still.
Okay.
Yeah, so in a way the questioning stops the moment it becomes heritage.
Okay.
And it becomes an experience, something that's packageable,
Okay.
marketable.
Okay.
And I've just come back from Georgetown, Penang, and everything is heritage in Georgetown.
Yeah.
there's nothing that's not heritage. And immediately when being who I am, I was just a little bit disappointed because it was just lumped together heritage site without any more of why was it made a heritage, the process of getting its sort of UNESCO label and all that. But I really feel as if when something's deemed heritage, it's almost as if it's a death knell. Because you stop asking questions, you stop trying to make sense of why it might be relevant to you in a very fundamental way, and then you just get fed in little booklets.
So that's partly what you meant.
But at the same time, it needed to be made a heritage site so that a label could be placed, so that it could actually be spared bulldozers. So in a way, they are kind of, it's a very paradoxical.
I have something to say to that. Go ahead, Josh.
Do you want to mention first?
We'll have time for both of them.
Okay.
You want to start?
No, I mean, I think the death knell, I was thinking about taxidermy. You know what I mean? You get the dead tiger, which is better than no tiger, right? And you know what a tiger is. But, to me, in a way, like when I go to Chinatown and I see shop houses full of Australian forex traders, I'm not sure that what we're looking at is history. I mean, you know, we need a much more complex series of stories to enable that and bring it back to life, right? Because otherwise, we just become fetishistic about forms or about age, right? Oh, the crumbly old one. You know, I mean, that's not. And what makes me worried about that is two things about heritage. That I'm not completely on Lowenthal's side, but I share some concerns. First of all, I think that heritage, in its simplification, often tells a master narrative about what history was in that particular case, right? It simplifies, it tells simple stories. That's why people love it. It's highly digestible. It's like a kind of soundbite. And the problem with that is that it very quickly can be bullshitized, right? I mean, like the narratives about things are often problematic, they're skewed, they have positionality problems, you know, either they're ahistorical. I mean, so much of what we believe about the past is total nonsense, right? So I think in that sense, heritage, while I fully appreciate conservancy and caring for our environment and keeping these things present and actually letting them change, right? But I worry that we kind of let them, in a way, we open the door to lies about history, about our past, and then about who we are, which is problematic. Not so much about the building. The other thing about it, though, is that heritage has another association which we should keep. And again, I know I keep going back to commercialization, but heritage is value, right? History, we don't take a position on its value. We go to back. Heritage is value-added history, right? And that also has to be considered, because I think one of the most problematic things is not how much we save, is that we don't save more. And I think that has to do with some very implicit calls about, for example, is mid-century modernism important architecture? Is HDB architecture in the 60s important? I think it's very important. I don't think that that's a consensus that's shared. And I think we could make arguments why, and I think Darren would probably join me in that. You know, so not just from a social standpoint, also from an architectural standpoint, these are magnificent buildings. And I think, you know, in a way, saying this has value, that doesn't, we have to be very careful about making that decision, because then we're making a decision about what elements of our society we're willing to let go and which ones we're not.
I mean, do you want to say a quick last word, and then I do want to see whether the audience has questions and comments.
Well, okay, so I try to organize my thoughts, maybe two responses. First one to Pin, and I completely agree with you that heritage sometimes it's not the way that Singapore Heritage Society thinks of the word. Maybe you want to think of good heritage and bad heritage. We like to think of ourselves as doing heritage that's very historically and research-based. But precisely for the reasons that Pin mentioned, sometimes I don't like to use the word heritage at all, because people misunderstand it. They think that heritage means all black and white photos of the past. Tell me your grandfather's stories what happened in World War II. And that's what it's not really about that. I think heritage is what's around us today, kind of how we organize our society and our city. Sometimes I like to use words like placemaking instead. Placemaking, also there's different ways to interpret placemaking. It can be very top-down, but I like to use Janet Pillai's definition, which is that it's a combination of a place, the people, and the function over time. Because that place identity, that relationship with the place and the uses that come out of it only slowly shape up over a period of time. And that passage of time is what makes history and what makes heritage. So that's a kind of definition that I like, because it brings in the people element, the community, the social element, and how it's always evolving, and our relationship to that, so it doesn't become ossified as well. And with regards to what Josh was saying about being very careful about how we make the decisions on what to save and what not to save. In the Singapore Heritage Society, we've been advocating for heritage impact assessment, which is a way maybe to make that process of taking into a policy-making tool that takes into consideration not just the kind of the strict technical criteria of architectural characteristics, but also things like social memory, how social issues, social impact, and it's a policy-making tool that is not being used in Singapore now. We don't necessarily yet have the expertise to fully implement that, but that's something that I think is something to work towards. And it may sound also very kind of structured, but it's a way to at least try to incorporate a wider range of considerations into that kind of decision-making process that government policymakers can use.
I could talk to these people all day, but at this point, let's see see whether there are questions and comments from the audience. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you all for very interesting discussions. I learned what we're debating here. My question comes from this observational one that I have had. Now it's like Singapore Heritage Week, and before that it was like Singapore Design Week. And when I was looking at all of those things, there's a lot of talking about how to keep our things, how to include elements of Singapore heritage and tradition into our current lives. I get reminded of this quote from Paul Kun, who said that like, tradition is dead if we don't adapt it and incorporate it into how we live now, and update it. And I feel that there's this. So at this point in the Singapore Design Week, there's a lot of the commercialization of the heritage, where like, we will preserve these things by making them into very pretty stuff and selling it. I love what you said about next to the bullshit. That's really great. And then there was another event of like a tour of the street of clans. We're talking about clan associations, and then them hiring a design firm to try to like make it more hip, but like putting hippie, like not hippie, sorry, like hip and young elements around there, putting art installations that include those elements. Like I just feel that there's this struggle that we don't really know how we're supposed to reinvent these things. And if we don't go the route of commercialization, like what else can we do? Like, you guys have any thoughts about that?
Yeah. What are alternatives to commercialization?
Well, maybe it's whether the commercialization is grounded in good knowledge about what you're dealing with. In the past, the NHB used to have a conference every year for heritage. Before now they have grants for heritage participation and all that. Before it was heritage industry grants. And you see all this commercialization in merchandising and everything. And really it's that the lack of content knowledge to help when it comes to coming up with these things. So maybe, I think it's that vacuum of knowledge. If we didn't have that vacuum of knowledge, these creative talents would have more stuff to work with, and it might come out better. Yeah.
Let's try to get a few more questions.
I have a response.
Okay.
This is Singapore. Do you expect anything less than commercialization? You commercialize everything and anything that can be made commercial, and that will be the end of us actually. But we're just going on this trajectory. I mean, if you don't want to commercialize a lot of these things, a lot of people who are trying to work with heritage information, it's very hard for them to package it because they won't get the kind of support that they need. So I do understand why people make pins and all that, because in order to get the information out, all that takes money and takes time and all that, and they need to. And this is where some of the grants come in. So the NHB does give out grants, but they always have conditions, as with all government grants. So you need to, kind of navigate them. And there are actually a lot of people who do things for non-profit, like them. They're doing a lot of heritage things, but it's not commercialization of any, sell things. I mean, not like what you see.
To all volunteers that we depend on your kind donations for an IPC charity, please think of us. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wondered to what extent people really are nostalgic for the past. To the extent that people are, it tends to be the past that's at a safe distance. In other words, 2 generations before. People who were taken out of slum, rat-infested shop houses where they were brought up, on the whole, wouldn't want to move back into those places.
It's true.
But their children and their grandchildren do tend to wax nostalgic about them. So it's like people who were in the war. My father, who fought in the war, had no nostalgic feelings about the war, whatever. But now we have a generation who looks back on war as if it's in some way glamorous. They didn't experience it. So I think nostalgia tends to be at a safe distance. That's one point. The other point I wanted to make was that Is it loss of identity that's key as much as love of the past? Because I've been in Singapore for 22 years, and even at that time, Singapore's become much more like everywhere else. And I was looking at some pictures on the internet the other day of Melbourne, and new developments in Melbourne, and the buildings are indistinguishable from the buildings which have been put up in the new financial centre down by Marina Bay. So Singapore is much less distinctly Singaporean than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, with the exception of things like Marina Bay Sands or officially sanctioned tourism board branding, which is a totally different field.
Should we try and maybe get a second question in, and then we'll try to address both, just as a way of getting more comments from the audience? And then but I promise we'll address both comments.
Thank you very much. I really learned a lot. My question is, maybe because I don't really come from a heritage studies background, so my question is actually, given the fact that, like, as we've seen today, there are so many multiple understandings and interpretations of words like nostalgia or heritage, and even history, I'm just wondering whether these distinctions that we make between memory, heritage, history, whether these are actually artificial, given the fact that even historical interpretations grounded on evidence and fact change over time given the context, because we always look back on the past from the context of the present, and the present will continually change, right? So my question is, firstly, do you think that maybe these distinctions between heritage and history are actually more artificial and maybe actually to some degree actually meaningless, and also maybe the way forward would actually be to equip students with the skills to be aware that there's no way out of this. Everything we talk about, even photographs, even experiencing the building there by itself, and when we share these experiences, they are still representations, right? Wouldn't it, perhaps the way forward be to equip students with the skills to be aware of this multitude of perspectives, of actually critically think through these sources? Yeah, so two parts to that. Thank you.
Maybe I can just address the first question, or comment. I think, it's true, one would think that any rational person would not want to return to a condition that's objectively kind of uncomfortable or grimy or sad. I think, unfortunately, human beings are just not very rational animals. I mean, we see incredible forms of nostalgia that make no sense to me. Like, for example, in South Africa, among people of color, there is nostalgia for apartheid. That exists, right? When there was a referendum to vote the end of apartheid, the Cape Province, the Western Cape, which has Cape Town in it, did not vote to remove apartheid, right? And it's majority non-white, right? So there are very strange kinds of conditions in which people are nostalgic for times that objectively were probably worse than they are today in many kinds of ways. I think identity does have quite a lot to do with it. I don't think it's just about time. I kind of try and resist the idea that cities becoming more generic means that the societies are becoming more generic. I'm not totally comfortable with that equation. I mean, if you look at Shanghai now versus Shanghai in 2001, when I was living there then, it's a completely transformed city, but I don't think that it's become more like New York or LA or Paris. I think it's still very much, its own animal. And I think even though Singapore has transformed a lot in that time as well, I don't see homogenization of the physical environment being equatable to a kind of a cultural homogenization. I'm not saying that people don't have identity concerns. It seems like the entire world is going to war right now over identitarian positions. But I don't think that necessarily means that it's either a result of or a cause of physical change in architecture in the city.
Yeah, I would also quickly agree with that. And I mean, that's also a very well-known phenomenon of like colonial nostalgia, where people actually are weirdly nostalgic for a period of time when they were in fact colonized. You might even want to think about whether that exists in Singapore, right? But I think the other comment would also, and it also goes back to Josh's earlier observation about just the whole accelerated way that history is operating, right? So I think while it's tempting to think that you need not just safe distance, but a certain amount of distance from something before you get nostalgic, but I think my sense is that distance is getting shorter and shorter by the day, right? I mean, if you're on Facebook, you're prompted to think back to an entire year ago when you did something.
It's like, do you remember back in 2014 when we used to listen to Kanye and like, I was like, what? That's now, right? I mean,
Or like throwback Thursdays where you have to think back an entire week, right? Actually, the Marxist theorist Frederick Jameson talks about this kind of acceleration of history, which he in fact considers like a condition for why we are this kind of deeply nostalgic society. Now, the second question from Rachel, I actually would agree that a lot of the distinctions that you see and that I actually very quickly flagged, oftentimes are perhaps not really absolute. You could even accuse some of these as being sort of slightly snobbish or elitist positions, right? That attempt to suggest that there is this kind of sacred or sacrosanct thing such as history and then like a devalued version that we call heritage, right? And in fact, if you want to observe that a lot of writers about nostalgia seem to themselves be oddly nostalgic, right? That instead, oh, let's go back to a day when there was such a thing as pure history. I don't think that's off the mark, right?
Finish your sentence.
What was I going to say? But I think having said that, whatever names we see them kind of giving to some of these categories, I do think it's nevertheless still worth thinking a little bit about sort of degrees, right? So is there a kind of I don't know, like a better way of doing heritage and doing history? I think that's what I was
I just want to say that maybe in the Singapore context, being nostalgic might be the only feeling that you can feel and as well publicly declare. Because in a liberal place like this, any utterance beyond that band might be construed against you. And that's the feeling. I mean, having made documentaries for 1995, almost 25 years now, I've gradually felt that my earlier positions for, this is tone, we're talking about preserving the past, was actually very much a defensive position for myself. Just because that was practically the limit of what you were allowed to say before you get thrown away and thrown away. But gradually, of course, the limit has increased. But I think we are still in way prisoner to this, or at least a large moderate swarm population. It's because the margins are very clear where they stand. But yeah.
I think unfortunately we are out of time for questions. But thank you so much for your participation, which I really should have left a little bit more time for.
But now can I
Yeah. Okay, let's get one more question.
It's going to open a can of worms.
But not can of worms.
Generally, in line with Pimpin's comments, I'm just wondering, there's a certain aspect in the excess of feelings that we, perform almost automatically resist. For example, like the Singapore Heritage Society, toning down certain more emotive aspects of the paper, or deliberately choosing to document things in a more impartial way. And this ultimately reinforces, by allowing us to speak to the state and speak to power, we are once again replicating the state and the power once again to people who are receiving the information that we're putting out as policy paper writers or as artists. So there's a certain kind of violence in that gesture where at one hand we are speaking about the suppression of excess and we are reproducing this gesture of suppression through the work that we are doing. So I'm just thinking about how we can step out of this cycle where we almost walking into this space and from the conversation there's this for lack of better word, demonization of this notion of nostalgia. And I'm looking at the title, there's nostalgia and conservation. And just now you argued for a more reparative look at the word conservation itself, where it's not necessarily negative. And I'm thinking perhaps it might be productive to have the same treatment to this notion of nostalgia. Yeah, that's all.
I would hope that I do think that part of what we've tried to do is to try to be a little bit more specific about different forms and different manifestation of nostalgia under different kinds of conditions. Even within that, I hope that we've at least offered you, in general, some notions of how it in fact could be rehabilitated, right? So for example, I think you heard Josh say very strongly and clearly that it really doesn't have to be the case that nostalgia is by definition politically conservative, right? In fact, I think we were implicitly making a kind of argument that in the context of a country that is so pro-progress and pro-development, nostalgia can in fact be a form of resistance or even subversion, right? Perhaps not under every single condition, but under some, right? What those conditions are, perhaps we could have gone further in order to specify it, right? I think other ways in which we have maybe suggested that it's possible to rehabilitate nostalgia would be to in fact notice that it's perhaps precisely to notice that nostalgia is even something that can be practiced or deployed by certain different people, right? So when Eileen kind of talked about the fact that in the position paper, they stayed away from maybe more sentiment-based language, I think she was also quick to mention that that was deployed in other ways, right? Yeah. So when you do outreach to the public, that's when you bring in nostalgia to encourage that kind of public engagement in these kinds of spaces.
I would say, I still wouldn't use the word nostalgia.
Sure.
I would say other kinds of feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah, as an American, we all wear our hearts on our sleeves, and like we love a political culture of weeping and apology. This kind of obscene profusion of emotion, which is very different from Singapore, right, in many ways. Although I have to say, I really do enjoy watching Eric say, I write about like affect in the city, like that's my academic area. So I'm really interested in the areas in which emotion like kind of explodes. So like obviously traffic. Like road rage is fascinating. It was like, because I think when you put Singaporeans in cars, they behave very differently than when they're not in cars. And I think that's true for a lot of people around the world, not just Singapore. The other thing is in part of my dissertation was I spent a lot of time in mega churches around, because I was writing about religious life here, and it's amazing. Everyone turns into like Jimmy Falwell when they go into these things. Like there's faith healing, and there's like a very unfiltered expression of emotion. And I think part of the emotionality is the way that many of these organizations kind of define themselves against what they see as a kind of a secular, unemotional state, which in some ways is very easy target, right? Because if you do, and there's studies of this, if you look at the history of political rhetoric in Singapore, there is a kind of a masculinist stoicism where it's, if you show emotion, and the one great emotional moment is what we see in those Merdeka ads before the movie where LKY cries on TV, right? And they bring that moment out and everyone's watching him crying on TV. And that's like it's almost like a baptismal kind of moment. And it's very interesting, that happens, but there is also, I saw this sticker in a bathroom stall right after LKY died, and it was a picture of him, and it said, "Stop crying, get back to work." So I think it's, as with all kind of like public cultures of emotion or affect, I think it's very interesting. We all have ways in which the mapping of something in one place is acceptable and another is not. And I think heritage is an interesting category because we have to make statements about a feeling about these buildings. We have to. Because we cannot argue for the preservation of Pearl Bank Tower based on metrics. They're going to have better metrics because part of the value is an intangible cultural value. It's about pride, or it's about many, many other things, a sense of spiritual uplift that architecture can produce. And we all know that architecture is never objectively describable enough that we can debate on the quality of that building. I can tell you it's sculpturally elegant, it's spatially bold. You can say the plumbing doesn't work above the 12th floor, which is also true. You could say that people walk down the stairs because the lifts don't come. They're inadequately provided for a building of that size. So in a way, I think there is a moment where we do have to short circuit a kind of a metrics-based, quantitative, kind of numerical appraisal of these, and really kind of open them up to a discourse where people do feel comfortable talking about how they make them feel. Whether nostalgia is the right emotional outlet, I don't know. I'm a little concerned about that, but I do feel that there has to be a shift in this direction. Otherwise, we are constantly talking within a very narrow scope of the debate.
And actually, as Tim reminds us, we actually had a moment, which I guess is still lingering, where we were in fact sanctioned by the state to feel all kinds of things, right? That moment was for SG50, right? You were encouraged to think about the past, whether in nostalgic ways or otherwise.
Only some parts.
Only some parts, of course, completely time. But for example, I actually think, and in a way we didn't really talk about it because it's not perhaps precisely an example of conservation, but speaking to your interest and your field, I actually think that there have been some recent movies made by filmmakers, commissioned by ministries, that in fact use very nostalgic modes. And what do they use those nostalgic modes for? In fact, they use those nostalgic modes to argue